Okay, welcome to the very first edition of Bench Talk here on Empty the Bench. Little 20-minute interview segments, discussions, and I'm Tom Albano, one of the hosts of Empty the Bench. And joining me, I have the greatest of pleasure of having James Lynch, senior MMA editor and journalist at TheScore. James, thank you so much for coming on to our first edition of Bench Talk.
Man, I'm honored. First show on video. Super happy about that, Tom. I really appreciate it. And it's good to be here. Apologies for being a little bit late. It's not Tom's fault. It's all on my end. I had another interview. So happy to be here, though. I'll make it up to you guys, though. This will be a good one. I promise.
Definitely. So I'm always thrilled when I get to talk MMA because it's not too often on a show where we do a lot of baseball, basketball, football, where I get to talk some MMA, use some of my fan-sided MMA knowledge, and get to talk with somebody else in the MMA media industry. And we'll just start things off with one of the bigger headlines of this past couple of weeks. Jon Jones, Jorge Masvidal, a couple of others feuding with Dana White, saying that it's a public feud, especially with Jon Jones and Jorge Masvidal, saying that they're not being paid what they think that they ought to be paid. Of course, Jorge Masvidal passed up on welterweight title fight, which is now going to be Kamaru Usman versus Gilbert Burns. Jon Jones, the failed negotiations between him and Francis Ngannou in the UFC. You had Conor McGregor retiring. What do you make of all this craziness going on, James, starting with you?
I think it's just bad timing. I mean, I don't blame these fighters for wanting to get paid more. I think all the points that Jon Jones made and that Jorge Masvidal made are absolutely valid. I mean, these are two of the biggest stars in the UFC. The problem is, though, Tom, is that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I kind of understand where the UFC is coming from, where it's like, we want to do these big fights. You guys want to get paid what you're worth, but we're not getting a live gate. We're not getting all that extra stuff that would come when things were back to normal and seeing fights with crowds. So I can kind of understand the UFC's perspective. Not only that, but just also the fact that, they're spending all this money on COVID testing. Like, that's got to hurt their bottom line a little bit as well, because it's not just the fighters, it's the production crew, it's the media that's there. I mean, that stuff's got to cost a bit to do all that. So I know the UFC's not losing money, but they're certainly not in the best financial position right now either with everything that's going on. So I just think, the timing of it's not very good. I have a feeling that they will come to terms eventually, but I think it won't happen until we start seeing crowds back with these events. And that could be a while. It could be next year, but I see both sides of it, because I can understand the UFC. If you're going to do a super fight with Ngannou and Jones, you got to have a crowd there, right? Like, you can't just do it with an empty crowd. I know they need to put on cards, but I think from the UFC's perspective, they're kind of looking at it like this. Like, look, we have this deal with ESPN. We have to put on a certain amount of cards a year, regardless of if Jones and Masvidal and whoever else can go or not. They're going to fill up those cards. So they really know that either way, they got to put events on. So if these guys don't want to fight, they'll just find someone else to do it. And conversely, for the fighters, they absolutely should be paid more. I'm a big advocate of, the fighters getting a bump in pay. But the problem is, now is like the worst timing with everything that's going on. So like I said, I think, Masvidal, Jones, I think Conor McGregor, I think all these fighters, I think you'll see them come back, but it won't be for a while once we have things sort of back to normal. And I don't have a medical degree, so I don't know when that'll be, but hopefully soon.
Yeah, neither do I. I really hope that all these sports start coming back soon. Obviously, we've been talking a lot of baseball on the show as of late, and who knows what's going on with that. And one thing you brought up was fighter pay. And yeah, for those of you out there who may not be following MMA as much, if you're thinking like fighter pay, like why now? You might have been under a rock, because this has been an issue going on for years with fighter pay. And it's funny you brought up the pandemic, because that was one of the parts I was going to talk about, because Dana White, during one of his recent press conferences, said with the pandemic going on, I mean, he's got to balance, the UFC has got to balance like how they can get fighters in, payment for these guys. So, I mean, you're right. Who knows when it's going to be? The issue is like trying to like schedule everything, and the limited amount of fighters. I know a lot of people were complaining about the most recent fight night card, but I mean, for what it was worth, that fight night card was pretty good.
It was. No, it was entertaining. I mean, you can't go wrong seeing finishes. I think the other thing too is that I think the fighters have to compete a certain amount of times throughout the year. So you have, a break in between there with COVID. That's why you're seeing some of these fighters like that fought like last week are now fighting again, right? Because they're trying to fulfill their contracts. So there's a lot of stuff at play here. And one thing I will give Dana White credit. I mean, he hasn't laid off any of his staff, right? I mean, we've seen how many companies, go under, or companies having to do cutbacks. So the fact that they're still trying to push forward without having to, fire anyone, I think has been pretty good as well. And again, I'm not taking anyone's side here. I'm outlining both ends where, like I said, fighters should be paid more, but also we got a pandemic going on. It's not ideal.
What did you make, going back to this point here, what did you make of Masvidal's tweeting, especially his most recent tweet where you talked about the White Knights and mentioned the UFC commentators?
Well, I think we should, be honest here. I don't think that's Masvidal tweeting that. I think Abe Kawa's manager is the one who's sort of doing a lot of that, because you also see some of the shots they're taking at another rival manager who's not very fond of the Kawas in general. We don't need to mention their names, but yeah, I mean, I think look. I mean, unfortunately, you're going to have people give their opinions, and some people are not going to like those opinions. And with Masvidal going after the UFC commentators for their comments, I mean, he has every right to. I mean, I would be upset as well if people are trying to, sort of downplay my worth. But on the same token, like, that's their job. They're commentators. They're supposed to give their opinion on things. So I think with Masvidal, it's just trying to get fans on his side and also sort of outline things. Because you look at most of the replies there, a lot of people are supporting him and supporting him getting paid more. So I think it's just a way. Same thing with John Jones with his tweets. I think it's just a way to sort of get people to understand the fighter's perspective. And it's such a unique time, like in society, where, fighters can voice their opinion. They don't need to go on a TV show to do it. They can literally just do it from their phone and tweet out stuff. So I think more than anything, it's just trying to get the public on their side, I think is more than anything.
And it's funny because all these big name fighters are like coming together and like having these issues with the UFC at the same time. Talk about John Jones, Jorge Masvidal, Henry Cejudo retired just last month and said he may come back if he's given a more lucrative offer. You have Conor saying that that nothing in the sport excites him. I guess the options, he doesn't like that the options he's being given. So what should be next for these guys? Because I agree with you. They're going to fight again. They're going to resolve this, and they're going to end up fighting again. The UFC can't afford to lose these guys, and they can't afford to not fight. I know maybe they'll take this year off, like Conor didn't fight in 2019, but 2021, when everything's back up and running, these guys gotta come back. So what do we do with these guys?
I think you just leave them on the sidelines, or you try and play hardball and say, look, you have nowhere else to go. Because here's the thing, Tom, as well. Like, these guys are under contract. It's not like they can just go to Bellator and say, yeah, screw you guys. Like Masvidal signed like an 8-fight deal. So they're kind of handcuffed here, right? So it's either they fight or they don't. And like I said, I think the only way they're going to get paid more is if things are back to normal with the events and everything, with crowds, with people buying tickets. Because the other thing is, like with McGregor especially, like how many Irish fans are flying all the way from Ireland to go watch him fight in the US? That happens all the time. So you're losing a huge chunk of that audience if you're not doing if you're doing a card without an audience. So that's why I think all those guys, if I was a betting man, I don't think any of them fight this year. Maybe they do. Maybe they come to some sort of agreement on finances. But a lot of these guys, I just don't see them coming back just because they don't need to. And again, like I said, the UFC is still going to fill up those cards. We might end up getting more main events that fans are going to scowl at with like Ian Calvillo on other cards, because the UFC just has to fulfill their obligations to ESPN and to the fighters and getting them enough fights. So it's a really interesting situation right now.
Yeah, I think the UFC is also contracted. Like, this is one of the big issues when we were first having the pandemic and the UFC was trying to work through, that they were going to be given some sort of bonus from ESPN if they got something like 50 or 40, 50, somewhere in that range, exactly, cards. And you mentioned that these fighters don't need to fight, especially Conor, because Conor, he's got the whiskey deal. He's got all the sponsorships. He's already made a whole of a bunch of money in the octagon so far. He doesn't necessarily need to bash his brain in the octagon for 25 minutes every time. And Conor has already said, I'm not a replacement fighter, and that's why you didn't see him involved in anything with after Khabib fell out and Justin Gaethje replaced him against Tony Ferguson at 249. That's why you're probably not going to see him in any of these empty arena cards, because Conor is kind of a special fighter in that, how like boxers, they always get like a portion of like the gates and the revenue. I feel like Conor is one of those guys who would get a whole lot of chunk from that extra stuff.
Absolutely. And yeah, Conor is a special case. And that's why, like, I'll just bring this up right now, because I do see people on Twitter being like, oh, Conor should fight like Paul Felder or Ali Quinton. Like, that's not going to happen. Conor's going to fight a big name fighter. Like, he is the exception to the rule. Like, he's not just going to come back and fight nobody. Like, that's not how the matchmaking works with Conor McGregor. It's a business, as it should be. You got to do a big name fight. That's why I think, like, because I had an article on TheScore a couple weeks ago about who Conor would fight next. And I had Poirier. This was before the Hooker fight was rebooked, only because that's a fight that would get him closer to a title shot at 155, even though Dana's pretty much said, like, hey, we'll put you up there. I also said Masvidal, because again, Conor would lose nothing if he fought Masvidal at 170. It doesn't matter. He's not after that title. He's not after fighting Usman. I know there's been rumblings about that fight, but I think realistically, that is one of the biggest fights you can make right now, just from a name value perspective. Masvidal was the biggest superstar last year, headlined one of the biggest pay-per-views last year at UFC 244. Him and Conor together would do huge numbers for the UFC. But again, that's not a fight you want to do now. You want to do it after, you know, the pandemic's over, and you can really utilize that the best you can. And then I think the other name I threw out there was Nate Diaz. He's always in the back pocket. You can always do that trilogy fight. That is a fight, I think, even though fans are maybe not as high on Nate Diaz, especially after that last fight against Masvidal, there's still people that would watch him fight Conor. So I think those are sort of the three options. Like people saying he'd fight Gaethje or fight Ferguson, that's not, there's no reward for him in the end of that, because of the fact that those guys are not, all those names I mentioned are bigger than Gaethje and Ferguson, and you're going to get a bigger payday, and they're more winnable fights, I think, for Conor. Like even with Ferguson losing, I still don't think that's a great matchup for Conor, especially on the ground where we know Conor has a weakness. The majority of his losses were by submission. So I see if Conor's going to fight someone, it's going to be a big name, and it's not going to be just anyone. So that's another wrinkle in this whole thing, is that it's not just will Conor come back. He's got to fight someone that's, you know, gonna make sense from a business standpoint.
Funny enough, you mentioned Conor versus Masvidal. Now I know Dana's already said he doesn't like that fight because he says Jorge is too big for Conor, but I could see with all the money that could draw. And you also talk about like how it's not the fight to do now. I guess the issue is, if not, when, because like you said, when are the crowds coming back? And the UFC's like pay-per-view schedule is kind of already set for a little while. You got the 3 title fights coming up next month on Fight Island. In August, you got Cormier and Stipe doing their trilogy bout. And then you got Khabib and Justin in September, which may also be on Fight Island, or at least on Yes Island if the Fight Island designation's not there. And then you got, and you mentioned this on the podcast, and I was just on your podcast, and I was just thinking about this before. Where's Israel Adesanya and all this? Israel Adesanya and Paulo Costa. So do you do that in October? I know the UFC usually comes to the Garden. That's where I met you in person last year for 244.
That's right.
Do you wait and say, you know, maybe get Conor and Masvidal in November and hope, you know, if the crowds are back, see if you can do the Garden, do something like that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot. We'll have to sort of see how things go, not only with COVID, but also how these cards book up. But you just mentioned it there. We're already up till October, right? And you still got to put Adesanya in a fight. And I imagine Adesanya is going to fight at some point this year, I would think, you know, travel restrictions and all that. So think about it. There's 2 months left where they have to do big cards. They could get away with that. They theoretically could, whoever wins some of these upcoming title fights, like let's say, you know, Volkanovski or Holloway or whoever, or you've got Jan and Aldo, you could do the winner of that fighting Sterling or something. They don't see, this is what I'm saying. They don't need those fighters. Like, yes, having them fight will make them more money, but they also don't need them to fight, because like you said, there's 2 months left in the year. They could get away with having, like I said, one of the winners of the upcoming fights fight someone else and fill that slot. But yeah, like if you're going to do a Conor fight and they are going to bring people back, then you would do it later in the year. But at the same time, it kind of goes to what I was saying before, where it's like the UFC doesn't need these guys because they're almost done the end of the calendar year, and they already have most of their big name fights already booked up. So it's it's going to get very interesting over the next couple of months to see what the UFC decides to do.
Another fight that just came to my head as you were going over that, we got Rose Namajunas, Jessica Andrade 2 coming up. I could see the winner of that pretty much challenging Wiley Zhang sometime in the fall.
Yeah.
What do you think is going on in Dana White's mind? Because I know I was discussing this with like friends when the Conor news broke, and they were like, "Oh, Dana's probably going to play it cool, but it's probably like raging going on." And then when the press conference happened after 250, he's dropping F-bombs like crazy. Do we think? You know, what do you think is going on? Is like what we see out there at the press conferences really what Dana White thinks of all this, or do you think there's more than meets the eye?
There's always more than meets the eye. I mean, there's business decisions. It's like, you know, it reminds me like a couple of weeks ago when Ngannou and Rosenstruik fought, and people are like, why isn't this for an interim title? And I could tell you why, and a lot of people didn't mention it. It's like, you can't just go from a 3-round fight to an interim title fight and not expect the fighters to get paid more and have to renegotiate those contracts. Like, people don't look at stuff like that. So kind of getting back to your point here, yes, there's probably a ton of stuff going on behind the scenes, but the main thing for Dana, more than anything, more than Conor, more than whatever, is him putting on cards and continuing to put on cards, because that's the most important thing. They don't get paid unless they put on cards. They have an obligation to ESPN. So I think, I think part of it is, I don't think it's as big of a headache for Dana as it could be, because he's already got enough fighters to fill up these cards. If it was a situation where half the roster's like, look, we're not fighting until we get a union or something, I'm talking super hypothetical here, but that only then would he have to worry if like a lot of his fighters are not willing to compete. But he's got half the roster already fighting. He's already got a bunch of title fights booked, a lot of big important fights booked. So I think he's doing okay. And I think it's just a tough time for him in general, having to not only put on these cards, but the logistics of it, getting the testing done, doing the events overseas on this fight island. Like the logistics for that must be a nightmare. Like who comes in, who doesn't, how many people can they bring? Like it's a lot of, red tape to get these cards to go off. So I think part of it, you're seeing him kind of lose a little bit, but on the other hand, he's the main thing is he's sort of already got figured out, which is what cards are going to end up happening. And he's sort of got the schedule laid out, like you said, until about October.
Another topic that has come up during these whole public feuding is the possibility of an MMA fighter union. Basically, like if they can't get it done now, then it's probably never going to happen. I don't think I've been in this industry as long as you have. I've only been here for a few years, but we've seen plenty of fighter unions, possible unions, come and go. There's like the MMA Fighters Association, the MMAAA. Yeah, Leslie Smith's Project Spearhead, and The Athletic actually just came out with a piece a couple of weeks ago that like 80% of fighters are for a union. Now I know it's going to be a little harder because these are all independent contractors, all under exclusive contracts to different promotions. But is this a possibility, you think, now or anytime?
If the time is to do it, it's now. And you would want to get, this would be the smartest thing, is getting Jones and McGregor and Masvidal and whoever else, the Diaz's, get everyone together and say, look, we're not going to fight. And then hopefully that would influence the other fighters. But yeah, if it doesn't happen now, it's never going to happen. And I think you need, the thing that they've always needed is a big name fighter to step up and say, like a Conor. If they had Conor say, I'm not fighting anymore, I'm going to create this union, everyone would listen to him because he's Conor. And two, like it would just, that's I think the only way they could get this to go. Like no one cares if Kajan Johnson or John Fitch or someone does it, because like to them, the UFC just looks at them as scraps anyways. They could get another welterweight, they could get another lightweight to fill up that spot. You can't replace a Conor McGregor. So that's where I think if they were to do a union, it would have to be someone big to do that. And I just don't see that happening, because I think in Conor's perspective, he's not hurting for money. Like you said, he's got the proper 12 deal. He's got other things going on outside the cage where he's financially fine. He still made a boatload of money off fighting Mayweather. So right. I think from his perspective, he doesn't necessarily need it. If this was Conor just coming in and he didn't have any leverage, didn't have any business deals, then yeah, maybe he would do it. But it's unfortunate, because I'm with you. I'm with a lot of people. I'd love to see the fighters unionize and get better rights. And not only that, but I think a lot of the things that fans miss is that we get better fights. We had fighters, training properly, not having to work a second job, not having to do all these other things. So right. It would be great if they could do it, but I just don't see it happening. It's the exact model as WWE, right? Like, yes, wrestlers can go somewhere else and fight and whatever. They can go to AEW, they can go to Impact, they can go wherever. But the big show, the number one show, is always going to be WWE, the same way the UFC is. And they built their model on that, where it's like, we're the brand and we don't care about anything else, because guess what? Like, we run the show. It's not like boxing where McGregor can go make his own card and fill out the undercard and do all that. It's the brand first. The brand is the UFC. And
even then, it's a little hard to do in a pandemic, because you mentioned WWE. Well, AEW is running shows and Impact is on an empty arena show. So I guess it's a little less of this in the pro wrestling side, but like here in MMA, Bellator is not running anything. One championship, right. Just getting back to it. Right now, the UFC has been the only show in town. And even if somebody like a John Jones, one of these associations, George St. Pierre was one of the leaders. You had St. Pierre and TJ Dillashaw, and that didn't work. So even then, I think somebody like a John Jones, it wouldn't work. It would have to work with something like a Conor. But now another thing that comes up is maybe taking this Ali Act, which is in boxing, and trying to push it into MMA. And I've been describing this to a few people. It works, I think, in that, you'll have more disclosing of salaries, you'll have more negotiation rooms. The problem is like you're taking the titles and all the cards and everything out of like the hands of Dana White and Scott Coker and all of them, and putting them into independent sanctioning bodies like we see with boxing. And if you were to only have one sanctioning body, what do you do? Do you have all the UFC champions be the champions of whatever this MMA sanctioning body? Like, how do you know Douglas Lima?
There's a lot of red tape. Exactly. I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of people make it out like you just put it in and everything would be fine. But no, you're right. They'd have to hand it over to the commission. And then we already have issues with the commission. Like, look how bad the judging is right now. Like, you want to put this in the hand of a bunch of people that are mainly boxing people that are scoring MMA fights like box. Like, it's tough, right? So it would certainly help things, but there's so much work that would need to be done to just get it to, like you said, the Bellator titles wouldn't mean anything, right? I think they would just say, oh, the UFC titles are the main titles, but then right. It's also like, you can't do like fun fights, right? Like, because it would be based off of like rankings and all that other stuff. Whereas we've seen like you wouldn't get like a Romero and Adesanya fight, right? You'd have to get whoever the next contender is, which I agree with. I mean, I was actually like that's one of the things I've argued, is that like they really should go with who's, based off merit, but then there's an entertainment side to it as well, where it's like, you want to see bigger. So it's really tough right now to see what they would decide to do with it. But I think overall it would help the fighters if they did have the Ali Act. They just have to, they'd really have to detail it out to make it work for everyone.
All right, running out of time. So a couple of quick questions here, rapid fire. So Fight Island's location is revealed, as we mentioned before, Abu Dhabi, which on Yas Island, which of course has held UFC cards before. I believe UFC 112, UFC 242 in September last year. What did you make of that? Because it's like, I'm not surprised, and yet somehow I am disappointed.
Yeah, no, I wanted it to be like Bodog, Costa Rica. If you guys haven't seen that card, go check it out. It's like a cool like backdrop with the beach and everything. It's not going to look like that. It's going to look like UFC 242, basically. It's going to look like every other card. So yeah, I was disappointed. Not really surprised, though. It has to be some incentive for both sides as far as putting this all together. But I mean, I'm still going to watch. I mean, it's, the fights are good. But yeah, I would have liked, like, or even like, I mentioned pro wrestling, like WCW Bash at the beach. Like, wouldn't it be cool to see the fighters like walk along like sand or something? I don't know. It would just be, they could have done something cool with it.
Or like Mortal Kombat.
Yes, exactly. Like Mortal Kombat. Exactly. Great reference. Yeah. So yeah, to answer your question, I am a little disappointed. Yeah.
Amanda Nunes is considering retirement after her win over Felicia Spencer at UFC 250. I mean, your thoughts? I mean, like, I would like to see her fight Megan Anderson one more time. I mean, Megan Anderson, and defend that featherweight title one more time. But what else is there to do? Like, I know she's not a pay issue.
Yeah, I was going to say it's not a pay issue. It's probably just like it's a really tough situation. Like, do you really want to see her fight? Like what happens if Aldana loses to Holly Holm? Like, who does she even fight next? We don't even know. And then, like you said, at featherweight, you could do Megan Anderson, but then, Nunes just beat Felicia Spencer, who beat Anderson. Like, it's tough. So I get it. The one fight I would like to see, and I know they fought already twice, but I would like to see the trilogy fight with Valentina, just because I think both have improved significantly since they both last fought. But that's it. I mean, the Cyborg fight was the only interesting one. I would have liked to have seen that rematch. That's never happening with Cyborg and Bellator now. But yeah, if Nunes wants to retire, don't blame her. She's got nothing left to prove, and it certainly won't. Like, I don't think fans are clamoring to see her fight like the Alreen Aldanas of the world going forward. I think if she wants to step away, she got nothing left to prove. She's done everything she needs to do. So yeah, not surprised at all, in the words of Nate Diaz.
And one last question: this one championship press release that's just coming out, where they basically have said they added to their war chest, but they've laid off like 20% of their staff. What do you make of it? I hate
That's the biggest spin of a press release I've ever seen in my life. I'm reading that, I'm like, hold on. So you released 20% of your staff, but then you got this big influx of money. Look, I've always said this: one championship, great to deal with from a media perspective. They're very good about getting interviews together, but there's a lot of stuff they do that you just sort of shake your head at, like that, like them talking about how many people are watching their shows, their YouTube channel. I have my questions about that. Interesting thing with their YouTube channel, if you go watch their views, that some of their videos are like 1 million views, but then you look at the likes, and there's only like 10 or 12 likes. So there's something off there with what they're doing with the numbers there. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on at one championship. But yeah, it's par for the course. I think a lot of us who cover the sport and understand it are kind of like, really? Like, this is how you're presenting it? Even Dana White, I saw, replied to Michael Fidel. I don't know if you saw that on Twitter, just saying, like, what the hell is this? It's crazy to see sort of what they're doing. But yeah, I mean, look, I'm all for other organizations doing events and giving a fighters, a home. But yeah, some of the stuff they do, you just have to shake your head.
James Lynch from TheScore, senior MMA editor, thank you so much for coming on to the premiere edition of Bench Talk. Great conversation here about all that's going on in MMA.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you so much for having me on. Anytime you want me on, you let me know. It's always good chatting some MMA with you. Keep up the great work, by the way, at FanSided. Love reading all your stuff over there. Your audience can check me out on Twitter and on Instagram at Lynch on Sports. The YouTube channel that we run at TheScore, all original content, youtube.com/TheScore MMA. We're always putting up like at least one video a day, so you guys can always see some different stuff that you won't find on other channels. And dude, this is a lot of fun. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Actually, late notice, but we have a comment from Max Popko, one of my good friends. Would love to see Amanda Nunes go for a third title. have her fight Wally.
Oh, there's no way. Yeah, there's no. She'd be better off going to 125 to try and fight Valentina. But even then, she said she can't make the weight.
I don't think Nunes wants to do weight cut anymore.
No, it's done. That's why Valentina's got to move up. You got to do that trilogy fight because Valentina's got the same problem at flyweight. There aren't a lot of contenders right now. She might fight Calderwood, but after that, I mean, who's Calvillo? But like even Calvillo winning on the weekend, do you really want to see her fight Valentina? I don't know.
Not yet.
Exactly.
I'm disappointed they're not going to do a trilogy fight, especially because I feel like when I watched that Nunes-Shevchenko second fight originally,
it was close. I thought Valentina might have edged it. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's the only fight that interests me. And Dana White already says it's not happening. So yeah, if Nunes wants to retire, go for it.
Cool. James, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you all for tuning in. We'll have more bench talk later on in the week. Until then, I'm Tom Albano. Take care, everybody.